Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another thing where I talk about things. Today, I would like to talk about U.S. politics because we've had some interesting developments. Whether or not they're good or bad developments depends on your perspective. We have people who are rather bearish and rather bullish. And if you're not familiar with the division between those two terms, the bears are the ones that are pessimistic and the bulls are the ones that are optimistic. This comes from an old... This is an old thing. This is like if you had a bear and a bull fight each other, the bull would reasonably want to jab its horns upward into the bear's abdomen, whereas the bear would want to come down on the bull. Or this is how it's been explained to me. Anyway, point is, bears, bulls, pessimism, optimism. There's pessimists and there's optimists about the economy and about the election stuff. But regardless of how you feel about it, it's been kind of interesting and it's been kind of weird. One of the bigger things they've been talking about lately is John Boehner, the guy who he was in charge of Congress, because Congress is all Republican at the moment, and John Boehner was in charge of the Republicans. He has stepped down because he's sick of his colleagues. He's had a few disparaging comments about them, and they kind of... It's sort of funny because I've seen a couple of different perspectives and different comments from different congressmen, and some of them are in denial, and some of them are just like, it's completely ungovernable, and you get this from different pundits as well. People looking at Congress, U.S. Congress, and they're just like, it's not ungovernable. Some of them are like, oh, it's not ungovernable. They'll get it figured out. They know what they're doing. They're gonna pull together. They own Congress now. We voted them in. They're all gonna work together, and they're gonna repeal Obamacare, I guess. I don't know. And then you've got other people who are just like, oh man, it's doomed. It's doomed. They're all doomed. Of course, the more left-leaning periodicals are the ones that are more likely to just be like, see, this proves it. Of course, the Republicans are nuts. But what's actually going on in Congress that makes this so significant is there's about 40 people in a caucus called the Freedom Caucus. And what those are like the Tea Party guys, the really far-right libertarian types that got voted in. And those are the guys that really want to shut down the government and stuff like that. Or they don't really want to shut down the government. What they're trying to do is they're trying to use the government shutdown as like a scare tactic to make the Democrats cooperate with them. They're a very no compromise sort of group. This is the trouble that John Boehner would report getting into, is that he would try to go up there and he'd be like, all right, I'm not going to negotiate with the Democrats. We own the House. We are going to get what we want. And then the Democrats would say the president's the guy who's got to sign things into law. So that, the president would be like, well, I'm not going to cooperate with this. And so John Boehner eventually would have to turn around. He'd be like, all right, we are going to make compromises. We are going to work with the Democrats a little bit. And then they would do that. They would work somewhat with the Democrats, and that's how they'd get a law passed. But the Freedom Caucus didn't like this. They never liked this. Their theory was that if they left the government shut down for long enough, then sooner or later the American public was going to realize that the Democrats were stupid, and somehow it was all going to turn out for the better. They would defund every social program in existence, and then the world would be a better place. They're very idealistic, very strange group, in my opinion. And there's a symptom, I think, of maybe a little bit of, maybe a fair amount of stress in our political system. Because I've talked about them before, how they kind of worry me, because when you look at highly idealistic groups like that refuse to compromise, oftentimes it's a sign of some really severe trouble, or it's a sign that corruption is a little bit too simple. Because people who are really extreme, they shouldn't really be getting voted into office. So you're looking at money is playing a big deal. I keep up on stuff that goes on, why do we get these people in office? And there's so many different things, and it depends on where they're being voted in. But there's gerrymandering, there's money politics, there's a lot of things that make it possible. And these guys are just kind of if anything, abusing the system to kind of get in. I mean, there's even voter fraud, although I couldn't say who, if any of them, would be perpetrating voter fraud. But it's kind of one of those things, it's voter fraud is a thing, and it's kind of hard to catch, though, because, for example, I was reading about, in Kansas, they were trying to investigate some voter fraud. There's a guy who suspected voter fraud, and he's been trying to investigate it, and even getting the records to determine whether or not there was any kind of weird discrepancy has been nigh on impossible. It's just been hell for him to try to look at this stuff. So there's very little, there's less oversight than you might think over the system, and so there might be some people taking advantage of it. And this is how you get really insane regimes installed into your government. is that somebody with an agenda, like a crazy agenda, starts to realize like, oh hey, I could just exploit this system, and boom, they get in. So it's not a lot of them though. I mean, it's like 40, which is a significant number, but 40, like they can't control the government, but they can pretty much throw a wrench into anything. And this is what's weird, is because of these 40 guys who are so extreme, it's like that's why we can't really do anything in Congress, because they try to bring laws to the floor and they say, all right, we're gonna do this, and we're gonna try to be somewhat moderate. And then these 40 extremist guys, they're like, no, I won't stand for moderacy. I just won't have it. Nuke the whales and Florida and everything else. Just I don't, just they have some kind of insane agenda. And so the guys that are more moderate are like, well, okay, if we don't have the votes from these 40 guys over here, then we can't pass the law. So what they wind up having to do, if they have to cooperate with the Democrats. And this is really funny, because the Democrats don't have control of the House, but because they have to rely on Democratic votes to pass laws, to pass Republican laws, it winds up being that the Democrats are still in power. They still have a lot of leverage, because it's like, well, these 40 guys over here aren't going to vote for anything unless it's like defunding Social Security, which is massively unpopular. Like any congressman who's still relying on actual votes and actual support from the public, any congressman still doing that is not going to be able to get away with like, destroying Social Security and like defunding all schools and all that, because these are the kind of things that they want to do. Is they just want to shrink government to pretty much just the military, and that's about it. So they can't get away with it. They've got to turn to the Democrats, and they got to say like, okay, what do we have to put into the bill to get you guys to support it? And very oftentimes they won't, or they can't do that, because the Democrats and the Republicans have two totally different views on what exactly they want out of certain bills, and so stuff just doesn't get passed. And then it comes to like talk about budgets, and they can't pass a budget, and then you wind up with like, the stuff just falls through. And so this has been U.S. politics for a little while now. They don't know how to fix it, and that's why John Boehner is stepping down, because he's just tired of trying to manage it, and they're trying to find someone who wants to take over. And for a little bit, like there would be like one or two guys who are like, yeah, I might take it over, and then they change their mind and they're like, you know what, actually, I don't think I really want to run this. This is, gosh, I don't want to be the face of this particular Congress. And it's tough to say how long this is going to last, because the thing is that if the extremists are in Congress because of tricks, like for example, if they're in because of gerrymandering, then it's not until around 2022, I think is what I read, that we're going to see any changes, because that's when they redraw the districts. So if those guys are in no matter what, because of gerrymandering or some other sort of rigging, it's not going to be until they go back and they do something that plays with that system rigging, before they're voted out of office. So they're going to be there. They might be there for a while, or for at least, another decade or half decade or so. So no one wants to lead another half decade of dysfunctional Congress, because that's kind of what it looks like is most likely going to happen. And then aside from that, I mean, in the midst of all the chaos or just the fighting and infighting in Congress, you've got the presidential election, which has also been really interesting, because you've got the established candidates that are kind of trying to go up there. Now, the first thing that was really neat was that we had, because of the Citizens United ruling, which said that money equals speech, and that you can donate as much money as you want into politics, and it's not harmful to the political process at all. We had something like in the teens worth of Republican contenders, just everybody who is willing to support some pet thing that some billionaire wanted, they got on the ballot. They're up there and they're like, I've got a billionaire who's going to give me $1 billion, and I'm going to run for president. And so we just got a rash of Republican contenders. And then one of them wound up being Donald Trump. And I don't know that Donald Trump is just already rich, so I don't know if he's actually taking donate. I mean, maybe he is, maybe he isn't. I don't know. I don't know about this, but Donald Trump just kind of appeared, and he's been like a circus act, really. I mean, like everyone, I'm not sure how much support is really behind him, and how much people just kind of want to see what Trump's going to do next, because he just says what the far right wants to hear. I mean, he just gets up there and he's just like, I'm gonna, I'm gonna dig up Mexico and I'm gonna load it into a cannon and I'm just gonna shoot it in the sun, and then people won't be able to come from Mexico into the United States. I will have solved the problem. And it's sort of like, you know, these kind of almost like, you know, for so many years they talk about like, oh, you know, illegal immigrants are destroying America, even though mostly all they're doing is they're just going to Florida and they're like picking oranges. And it's like there's not really a, you know, illegal labor is not really it hasn't been a job destroying thing in the States. And you know, the reason why they don't crack down on it is because if they did, then the cost of food would increase, and you know, like, they're really not sure, like, would the net increase in like jobs in the States, like because these are seasonal farming jobs, would that really be enough to be better than like decreased food prices? So I think they just kind of go with it, just sort of turn a blind eye to the illegal immigration, and they just, you know, okay, like, you know, these things that immigrants do, it actually has a net gain for the economy, or it might. And so you get into that sort of thing where you have the politicians who are like, oh, you know, illegal immigrants are destroying the country. But the truth is, you know, it may be highly exploitative, but potentially it has a net gain on the economy. What they don't get into is the H-1 visas, or they don't get into this very much, but the H-1 visas are these visas that are set up for like skilled positions. Like, suppose you need an engineer or a skilled programmer to come in and work for your company. Well, what you can do is you can get an H-1 visa, and you can import someone in from India. And that guy from India will then work that job for substantially less than an American guy will. You know, he may not even work for medical benefits or whatever. And he doesn't have a lot of bargaining power, because if he decides he wants a raise or something like that, then the business just says, oh, well, we'll pull your visa and we'll send you back to India. So it creates a lot of leverage for employers, and that actually displaces high-paying jobs. You know, and it's not really, it makes a company more profitable. But, you know, when you pay like a skilled professional chicken scratch, it's not like with food, you know, where everybody is buying this product, and like the more you produce and the cheaper you produce it, you know, it's not like, you know, like if you produce a new Adobe program, like Adobe's gonna sell it for whatever they sell it for, you know. It's not like, software's not one of those goods that necessarily gets cheaper if the costs going into it are cheaper. They're kind of just trying to maximize revenue. So anyway, so the H-1 visas, these are one of the things that they actually do use, but that's not illegal immigration. That's totally legal. That's legal. The government supports that. The government provides that, and you don't really see, like, no Republicans, very few Republicans anyway, are really talking about curtailing the H-1 visa programs. And so, you know, it's kind of funny. You get this sort of double think in a way, where you're seeing a lot of this. So, but Trump gets up there though, and he's just sort of riding this culture of like, you know, like they're always talking about, you know, illegal immigrants are a real problem, and it's sort of a red herring. And Trump is willing to go up there and just rail on illegal immigrants like they're an actual problem, like they're a core problem that needs to be stopped. And there are extremists that like this. Like I say, I think there might also be people who just really like to watch Trump. They just want to see what Trump will do next. And then over on the left, it's a wasteland. There's nothing. I mean, like, you like look and you're like, so who are the contenders? And it's like, well, you've got Hillary Clinton, and well, there's Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders has been really fascinating because, I mean, like, Hillary has been, I mean, she's part of a political dynasty, and so she's such a representative of the status quo that I feel, I mean, like, even my left-leaning friends, and I have a few friends who are, you know, very far left-leaning, and you talk to them about Hillary, and they're just sort of like not motivated. Like, they just, you know, like, if you were like, so you're gonna get out of your house and like vote for Hillary Clinton, and they're just kind of like, you know, I mean, if somebody dragged the voting booth to my house and they made me vote, I would vote for Hillary over a Republican, but that's only because I would always vote blue over red. I don't know. So I've seen, like, even from my far left friends, I'm not really seeing a lot of enthusiasm for Hillary. And part of the trouble is that it's because she seems to just be taking whatever stances are most politically viable. I mean, for example, we've had the TPP, the trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership thing that's been going on. And this has been a really controversial bill because speaking of losing jobs, what the trade bills do is they open up borders on Vietnam or whatever, where you can get access to very, very cheap labor and very poor environmental regulation and stuff like that. And companies will just take all their manufacturing and they'll put them in Vietnam. They can exploit child labor, stuff like that. There's all kinds of things. Those nations just don't have a lot of protections for the people, and our companies will exploit that. And that's one of the big things that the trade agreements do. That's when they talk about free trade, they really just mean freedom for American businesses to work in places with worse regulations, or with less humane regulations. So NAFTA cost a lot of jobs, and they're thinking that the TPP is going to cost a lot of jobs, and also for something that I'm concerned about is that they're going to harshen copyright laws. For example, one of the things that exists currently, the TPP has been all but finalized. I mean, they've given the president fast-track authority, so that means that the president can actually just send the thing to Congress for an up or down vote. It's going to be a couple months before it gets to this, but it's looking like it's pretty solid because most everyone in Congress is very pro-corporate, and they want to get this thing through so that the stock market, because they have investments in these companies, and so they want to have the stock market go up and they make a big return. But for the average person, it's probably going to be kind of harsh. They're worried about ISP companies. I mean, even ISP companies are worried about the new copyright provisions because the trouble is that what they're trying to do is they're trying to make ISPs more responsible for piracy. So if you download torrents or something like that, like if you pirate a TV show or something like that, then they want to hold your ISP accountable for it. Like your ISP is supposed to be tracking you and looking at what you download, and if someone can show that you downloaded something you shouldn't, then they want to punish you for it. And like I say, they want to make the ISP be the people who put all the money and effort into finding the pirates. So ISPs don't really want that, and plus it's going to be invasive. It's going to be a real pain. Familiar as I am with currently existing automated systems that they use to track piracy, it's unlikely that it's going to be a painless sort of thing once that goes through. They're also extending copyright in other countries. I mean, Canada's going to have to extend copyright protections by another 20 years. The American pharmaceutical companies are going to get extended patents in other countries so that they can kind of sit on their patents for a little bit longer. It's just very it doesn't sound real promising. I mean, nothing about it really does. So Hillary Clinton originally was supportive of the TPP, but then when she realized that supporting the TPP was going to cost her support from basically every major union group in the country, she changed her stance. She was like, oh, well, if that's the case, then, and plus, I'm sure that, ordinary voters might be a little frustrated if they're paying close attention. So she goes, well, if that's the case, then, I'm against the TPP. It's fine. I used to be on the board of directors of Walmart. I think I've made enough money. I can deal with not making another big stock return. So she kind of flipped her stance, and she's been like this. She's been incredibly flaky. She's just sort of she's like a wet noodle politician. I mean, you can't be excited about someone who's just going to do whatever's most beneficial to her. Whatever mercenary position she's got to take to stay in politics or to get her way. It's just not real great. But like I said, I mentioned Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders has been funny because he's a dark horse in politics, which means most people don't think that he's going to get elected. And I keep reading articles where, every month, someone writes, or maybe every other week, someone writes an article and it goes, here's why Bernie Sanders will never get elected. And then, a lot of times it comes down to money. It's like Bernie Sanders would need to raise $15 million, and he just can't do that without support from a billionaire because, you can't motivate people to send Bernie Sanders money. And then, a week later, someone writes an article and they're like, turns out Bernie Sanders did raise about $15 million, all donated to him by people who really like what he's saying. And it keeps going like that, where you just keep watching Bernie Sanders is starting to overtake Hillary Clinton in the polls. His platform is, he's sticking to his guns, and he just gets, he's like, I want to tax rich people. And there's no other politician that's running on this platform of and this is what's weird, is you're watching the wealth disparity grow and grow and grow, and you're not seeing any politicians who are in favor of wealth redistribution. It's like a dirty word. In the States, we have this cultural history of fighting communism and fighting socialism. So for us, our foreign viewers don't get us. I know that we have people that that watch my stuff, and I've talked to them about politics, and they're like, I just don't get America. Like, I don't get how you guys can be against, like, funding schools, you know, or like against national health care, you know, like why would you want your health care to be more expensive and just be profitable to like some jerk like in a suit somewhere? You know, you get into that, and it's kind of like, well, you know, you have to realize that we fought communism for the longest time, and any kind of like state assistance is considered communism these days. So we just don't go for it. It's a cultural thing. And Bernie Sanders is like, yeah, I would tax the rich, and you know, oh gosh, it's unheard of. No one else in politics really wants to tax the rich. But here's what's weird: is though he keeps making ground and he's supporting things in an idealistic way. Even if Bernie Sanders is an honest guy and he's going for what he wants, it's still you get that same thing like you see with Trump or with this Freedom Caucus, where you're kind of looking at like somebody highly idealistic is getting in. It's from a different perspective. But what's worrying about like Sanders, for example, gaining so much popularity and support is, again, you're seeing people who are like very highly disgruntled, and they're willing to go with someone who is supporting stuff they think is going to make a big difference. And the trouble is that a lot of what we're dealing with right now, where we're looking at like the economy and the job market and everything like that, there's so much all contributing to what's going on. I mean, there's so many variables. Macroeconomics is so complicated that you really can't fix it by just raising the tax rates. And not saying that maybe like raising taxes on the rich might help. It might help considerably for certain things, but it won't solve everything. I mean, like, for example, you're looking at job loss. We're automating a lot of jobs. And so there's a lot of things like you see people talking about like, well, if you raise a minimum wage, then it's going to be cheaper to just install robots that take your orders directly. And then, you know, you won't hire people to take orders anymore. And so those jobs are going to vanish. And that's a valid concern. But this is the thing where like that technology is going to continue to get cheaper as time progresses. And eventually they're just going to replace those jobs no matter what. And I remember, I mean, they've written books about this. This is one of these like cyberpunk dystopia things where you're like, okay, well, so we're slowly letting robots take over. So the people who own the robots are making all the money, and people who can't afford to buy or make their own robots really are just unemployable because the robots can do everything the people can. And so you get into these sort of, the wealth disparity starts to get really nutty, and so you have a very small group of people who are making tons of money. And as we continue to go in this direction, I mean, there's not really you can't solve that with taxes necessarily. I mean, you kind of could, but you're really going to have to rebuild society from the ground up and set up your system to respect automation as the new source of like blue-collar labor, you know. And we're not quite at the point where we're replacing all blue-collar labor with automation, but they're working towards it. I mean, like, AI is getting more sophisticated, and it's just going to be such a difficult problem to really tackle, especially with the way that the speed at which technology grows. I mean, things that they do some pretty astonishing things. I mean, we may not have our hoverboards yet, but we do have some pretty phenomenal things. I mean, like, your cell phone is a computer within itself, and it really blows away any technology that they would have had, say, back in like the 40s. You know, within a century, we've got little computers in your pocket. I mean, like, I can browse the internet and do complex math problems. I can access Wolfram Alpha, you know, on my phone. So, like, I could be anywhere in the world, and I could be solving complex differential equations just by loading up Wolfram Alpha and typing in the equation I need to deal with. Stuff like that. Like, that's you know, amazing technology, like an amazing advance that you know, that just the current government system is going to have a really hard time tackling the more that we get into that sort of stuff. So Bernie Sanders, though, I mean, he's making a lot of headway, and like I say, some of the things that he wants might be good, but there's a very stern amount of idealism surrounding what he's pursuing, and it's going to be tough, even if he has the means to get the laws passed that he wants. It's going to be really tough, even if he got everything that he wanted. And the trouble is, he's probably not going to get everything that he wants, because, like I say, Congress isn't really due for a redistricting until another half-decade or so. So even if Sanders got elected, it might be possible that he could be like a lame duck for the first half-decade or so. I don't know. But it's weird. It's very weird. The other thing I've been reading about, too, is you keep reading about the federal interest rates. And this is another kind of thing. I've tried to wrap my head around exactly how this works, but they've been at zero for the longest time. And what federal interest rates are is every bank is required to have like a certain amount of equity. And equity is like you've got these liquid assets. So if there's an emergency, you're sitting on this little cushion of cash, and you can work things out and you'll be okay. The trouble is that current regulations have had kind of the amount of equity that they've required banks to have is a little bit low. It might not really be enough to save like a financial crisis. And so the banks kind of rely more on bailouts than they do on equity. And they haven't really corrected that since the last crash. So if we have another crash, the banks are still maybe not sitting on enough equity. And if the crash is big enough, they're going to get wiped out again, and we're going to have to do another round of bailouts. And anyway, though, to keep their equity up, to keep their equity at whatever levels, what banks will do is they will borrow from each other, from the feds or whatever. They borrow money. And so they wind up with a debt, but they have a certain amount of money, still to cushion on. So this is something that they're legally required to do. When the feds release a interest rate of 0, then that means that when the banks borrow money to just kind of sit on, they don't have to pay interest on that debt, so they can just sit on the money and sort of be safe. It's a nice, convenient thing. This allows them to loan out more money safely. So they say like, okay, like we'll just take out a loan from the feds and we won't have to pay it back until we're ready. And so we'll give out a loan, and we'll, if that money comes back, then great. If not, well, it's okay. We don't have to pay interest. So this has been great for people who want to take loans, like large businesses and investors and things like that. It's been good for the banks. It's been good for the upper crust of society. Hasn't really done a whole lot for the average person, because the average person is not really able to capitalize on major loan agreements with low interest rates or anything like that. We don't do the major investments. I mean, like personally, I've got a couple $1,000s in the bank. I could take all that out and I could throw it at the stock market, or I could do, but then I wouldn't be able to afford rent. So it's kind of like that paycheck to paycheck thing. You really don't get to invest with that paycheck to paycheck deal. And the feds are talking about, they want to raise interest rates again because they don't want to cause inflation by doing this. Because if they continue to loan out money, and then the banks loan out money, and then they maybe don't make their returns, then they just continue to pull money into the system, and then the money doesn't really come back, and you get inflation. You can get out of control. And so the feds want to raise interest rates so that they can sort of prevent, they don't want inflation to be a problem. They don't want people to be waiting in bread lines with like sacks full of money to buy a loaf of bread. So they want to go back on the 0 interest rate thing and start charging interest again. But the trouble is that every time they start talking about raising interest, something else happens that causes the economy to slow down. And so you're winding up with like, and it's different things, it's not all like the same stuff. Like you can't point to one problem and say, okay, that's causing the economy to slow down. But it's really funny because you get the bulls and the bears, like I mentioned earlier, and you watch and the bulls are like, everything's rising up, jobs are taking off, the economy's starting to heat up, everything's good. And then you get the bears, because the next quarter then, like, they adjust, they look at the jobs, they're like, yep, hiring halted, and everything's slowed down, people aren't buying anything, and this crashed a little bit, and so it's kind of like we have these, it looks like it's recovering, and then you get this huge, like, adjustment, that just like drops everything down, and it's like, oh, okay, so the economy hasn't exactly recovered. It's still super sluggish. And one thing that people point to this is they say like, well, it's because there's been no recovery in the middle and lower class. Like the middle and lower class are still earning stagnant wages. Like you've given all this money to these corporations and they're more profitable than they've ever been, but they're really not raising wages. They might be reinvesting into other things. They're buying other companies. They're doing a lot of mergers and stuff like that. But even the mergers, oftentimes like a merger can kill jobs because two companies might merge and then they just, whatever seems to be not profitable, they just kill it. They throw it away because they merged. It cost them money to merge and they're trying to make back their investment. They don't want some unprofitable thing. They're not going to work with some dying, some sick dog to try and fix it. They just kill it. They give it the axe. So yeah. Consumers have not recovered a whole lot or really well. And so the economy just continues to be very sluggish because they can throw all this borrowing power at the top of society. But unless the top of society starts buying tons of stuff, enough to make up for everyone else who's not buying stuff, it doesn't really mean that the economy's not really able to heat up in any significant way. So they keep doing this, and the Feds keep looking at this, and they keep saying like, okay, well, we might raise rates. Oh, no, we're not going to raise rates. We're not going to raise rates again. And they're starting to talk about like, what if we slump into another recession? Because that could happen. And like when you talk about this stuff, like there are people, like I say, you get bulls and you get bears, and the bulls just say like, well, you know, it's cyclical and we're gonna be fine. And then you get the bears and they say like, well, you know, there's some signs that it's not gonna be cyclical. You're starting to look at these, for example, bonds, for example, like the non-banking bonds, like trash bonds. They're starting to show signs that they're not doing real hot, and there might be another crash on the way. It's hard to say. Everybody always tries to predict the market. But bears always want things to crash because, you know, they short sell. Like they buy everything now and they say, yeah, I'll pay you whatever it's worth later. So they invest now and you know, sell off the stock, and they make a fortune when things crash. So bears want to crash, bulls want things to rise. And then you got alarmists, of course. And alarmists are the worst because alarmists just like pluck all kinds of crazy statistical data, and they're just like, you know, everything's gonna die. Buy my book and I'll tell you how to survive the financial apocalypse. But the more realistic bears that you're looking at are kind of just looking at like, you know, it's not going to be there's not going to be like a catastrophic crash, but you might see another just another real nasty slump in the markets. It's possible. You might not. The bears are saying that it's cyclical and things are going to get better, you know, like we're going to recover. But of course, you know, the bears could be right, the bulls could be right. You don't actually know. Whatever happens, it's not going to be like an apocalyptic crash. But the Feds have been talking about, they talk a little bit about the concept of going from 0% interest to going to negative interest. And when I say that I don't really quite understand this is one of these things I don't fully understand what it means if the Feds talk about going to negative interest. Because normally when you take a loan, like I say, you charge interest on the loan, right? Which means that they pay you to you know, sit on that loan for a while. So if you're charging negative interest, does that mean that they continue to hold this debt, but you gradually give them money? Now, does that mean that they use that money to pay the debt off, or that you're loaning them more money? So suppose like you came to me and I gave you $100, and I said, all right, you know, and then tomorrow I'm going to charge you negative 100% interest on that loan. Does that mean that tomorrow the debt is forgiven, or does that mean that tomorrow I give you another $100, and now you're sitting on $200, and you technically owe me $200? But I just automatically gave you $200. I think it means the forgiven thing. I can't fathom, because it's a little too wonky to imagine that they would just continue to give money to banks, whether the banks asked for it or not. It's like if the banks needed more money, they would ask for it. It must be that they just forgive portions of the loan over time. But apparently some banks in Europe have done this, not in a total extent, but in some programs they've done negative. I was reading that they've done some negative interest rates on things. And talking about inflation before, what this does is it causes inflation to go up a great deal, and so it can cause the dollar to be worthless. So basically, if you're just an average citizen, you've got money deposited in the bank, if they start doing negative interest rates, then your money is going to very rapidly lose worth. And so people who are just saving money, you know, depositing money, your money's going to lose all its value. So that's what they're thinking of next. If we have another market crash, that's potentially where they could go. But that's like scraping the bottom of the barrel. And like the Feds have said that they, you know, like they think about it. This is why I say like they're not like talking about this like, oh yeah, that's what we're gonna do next. They were just talking about like people ask the Feds things all the time, and that was like they were speculating on negative interest and on whether or not it was gonna help. And the thing that they said was that they could do it, but it wouldn't be very helpful, and there would be negative consequences for it as well. And so they really don't want to go into negative interest. There are some countries that have done small amounts with negative interest, but it kind of tells you it's sort of like just like a little bit weird. You know, the whole thing, just following politics right now, it's kind of like, gee, I'm sure it would be good if things got better. And you see all these different politicians who are like, things are getting better, you know, like everyone, you know, it's gonna go great. It's going really well. But internally, you're seeing all this conflict, and you're seeing like idealists and extremists that are getting voted into office or that are gaining a lot of momentum. And I think, like, for example, like Sanders, I think is a little bit more trustworthy as far as the candidates go. Like, I like some of the things that Sanders supports, but he does seem somewhat idealistic. And I just don't see, like, if you vote someone like that, if it turns out that Sanders is a really honest guy and you get him into office, like a really honest guy like that, like you see this in governments that have real problems, where sometimes a really honest guy does get elected, and then he sits down in office and he goes, all right, so I'm going to take my integrity and I'm going to give the people what they want, starting, oh wow, this is a lot of paperwork. And so you find out that the whole system is rigged to pretty much prevent integrity. So I worry that maybe, like, you could get someone like Sanders in, and it would turn out that Sanders really had some good ideas for the economy, or for, you know, just for taxes or whatever, and then he would sit down and find out that the whole system is kind of designed around corruption at this point, because it's been screwy for so long. So, like, when someone just sits down and tries to do something honest, it's like, oh wow, there is a lot of red tape to prevent honesty. Wow. like, you know, and you just can't repeal it, because, like, you can't repeal these things because some of that red tape, it's not really there to specifically prevent honesty, but it was there because of some prior corruption, like somebody was gaming the system in another way, and so, like, they added a regulation, but the regulation had a loophole, so there's, like, a new sort of corruption that appears. So you have to be, like, you just have to be insidious to work with the system and to get ahead or do anything. So I don't wonder if maybe that's what'll happen, is, like, well, we could get Bernie Sanders in there, and maybe he's got that integrity, but then he'll sit down and he just won't be the insidious, like, you know, snake-tongued prophet of doom that we were looking for. You know, what we really need is freaking Lex Luthor for president. So anyway, bottom line of this personal time, Lex Luthor for president. He may not be the best guy, but he can probably make the system work. So I don't know. Like I say, I try not to be pessimistic. I'm a worrier by nature. Like, I worry about things, and so when you hear me talk about stuff, I oftentimes think of things in a more, like I said, in a more bearish light. But when I do so, you know, like I say, bear in mind that's me, and there are people who have a more optimistic take on it. I mean, if nothing else, it's an interesting circus to follow, like, just to see the stuff going on. There's people who still feel like the GOP will be fine. I mean, it could turn around, because it's not like people are unaware of this stuff, and they really are talking about it. And internally, like the States is still it's not all corrupt. I mean, like, there's people who are still beholden to the public and things like that. So it's just very interesting. I can only imagine what it must be like to be an actual politician and to have, like, you know, these are the things that I want, but these are the things that I have to do, and then I have to explain to the public, like, why did I do this thing and not this thing, and how do I hang on to office, but then also appease this, you know, how do I kiss the ass of the right corporations so that I can keep doing what I want without, you know, without losing my seat. I don't know. This is just madness. Politics is madness. Yeah. But anyway, though, Lex Luthor for president. That's it for today. Thanks for joining me, everybody. I will catch you all next time.